Hi, it's Steve with Paladino Power Project, bringing you a video on using run power in a threshold anchors approach to training prescription, and actually how run power fits quite well with this concept of threshold anchors. In doing this video, I'm going to come and use this particular chart. And I just wanted to introduce it to you at this point. It's using the contemporarily accepted intensity, exercise intensity domain names: moderate, heavy, severe, extreme, and some of their markers for defining the boundary areas between these intensity domains. So this chart I'll come back to multiple times, but I wanted to introduce that. And I also wanted to point out the use of phase transition down here. This little gap between moderate and heavy, it's small, but it represents a phase transition. The concept of a threshold where over here you're at moderate and over here you're in heavy, and there's completely different physiologic responses. No, that's not how. There aren't any thresholds of that nature in these exercise domains. So instead, phase transition instead of threshold is the terminology I prefer. And each one of these you can see have multiple different markers. Ventilatory threshold 1, lactate threshold 1, gas exchange threshold, maximal lactate steady state, LT2, ventilatory threshold 2, and respiratory compensation point. All of these are very different markers that all try to identify this phase transition or mark that phase transition. And all of these are protocol and model dependent. I mean, using lactate threshold 2, I mean, there's over 20 lactate threshold 2s that have different protocols, different models. So phase transitions with multiple various markers in the lab that can be used that define that phase transition between moderate and heavy and severe intensity domains. So with that aside, let's get into what prompted me to do this video. And what prompted me was Alex Hutchinson's recent article, January 5th, 2026, on why threshold is more important than max heart rate or VO2 max. And essentially saying that choosing, he used the word pace, but we'll use the word effort, or more specific to our conversation, power, based on the physiologic transitions, or those phase transitions that I spoke of just a moment ago, more effective than calculations based on maximum heart rate, or for that matter, VO2 max. This article came out recently. It illustrated this point of using threshold markers, which, if you've been using run power or cycling power going back even further, as I have, going back to 2002 with cycling power, in 2016 with run power, you already know this, that these using a physiologic type of marker for those phase transitions and using your prescription of training based on those markers is quite important, and certainly far better than max heart rate or VO2 max. This concept is further supported and has been for quite a while in the scientific literature. Jamnik in 2020 published a great article that I recommend, where basically stated prescribing intensity exercise or exercise intensity based on fixed percentage of maximal anchors, that would be heart rate max, speed max, or velocity max, VO2 max, has little merit for eliciting distinct or domain-specific homeostatic perturbations or stimuli, so to speak. And furthermore goes on to say that prescribing exercise intensity based on a fixed percentage of these maximal anchors has substantial shortcomings as a means for normalizing exercise intensity across individuals. Myler in 2023 did a study and summarized by saying the using physiologic thresholds to prescribe exercise intensity reduced the heterogeneity of exercise tolerance or sustainability and physiologic responses. So added an additional element in terms of sustainability. I'll get to that in just a second. And goes on to say that to increase the precision of exercise intensity prescription, it's recommended that where possible, physiologic thresholds, i.e. Markers for the first and second phase transitions, are used instead of VO2 max or a max marker. And in this study, they prescribed training in the high end of the heavy domain as well as in the severe domain based on either physiologic marker or percent of VO2 max, and found that in the top end of the heavy, that would be your tempo or subthreshold intervals, only 30% completed it when it was prescribed by the traditional percent of VO2 max. Only 30% could complete the prescribed workout, whereas the ones that are defined on physiologic marker of that second phase transition, all were able to complete it. And furthermore, those exercise prescriptions ended up being below critical power, whereas even though the intent was to get it right using a percent of VO2 max, the work rate exceeded critical power in 70% of the individuals. That's trying to target that high end of the heavy domain. And when they went to high intensity interval prescriptions, only 20% were able to complete it based on percent of VO2 max, as opposed to all individuals completing their HIIT based on their physiologic marker. So not only do you get different physiologic responses, but you also have different tolerances and sustainability depending on whether you're using physiologic anchors for those phase transitions or using a percentage of max. In most recent article by Hansen et al. Says that, of course, guidelines for exercise prescription are often recommended as percentage of peak effort, like max heart rate or max VO2. But when you use such a prescription methodology, it's associated with a higher inter-individual variability and acutely induced physiologic responses. So the stimuli are different metabolically when you use max versus using a physiologic. You get a little bit more precision using a threshold-based prescription. So, and then lastly, Myler, who I mentioned earlier, the 2023 article, the 2025, just recently, actually came out and did another study and actually listed the traditional anchors like VO2 max or heart rate max or heart rate reserve, which incorporates heart rate max, as traditional anchors, and these are the no-goes versus the physiologic thresholds, which identify the phase transition between moderate and heavy, which I listed in that previous slide, or the phase transition between heavy and severe, which are listed here, also listed on the slide, and includes critical power. All right, so when we come back to this slide, we have those markers here, and we can add that, of course, when you prescribe by VO2 max, a percentage of VO2 max or a percentage of heart rate max, the further away you get from that, the more variance you get in the actual metabolic outcomes of that, or the actual metabolic stimulus. So this is a no-go. Prescribing based on power max or velocity max, similarly a no-go. And if you're using a 220 minus age as your heart rate max, that's even worse. So the bottom line is just cross those off of the list. If you're training by heart rate reserve, heart rate max, throw it out the window. All right, it is just, as I've stated already, and scientific literature supports this, just not the way to go. So, what is the way to go? Of course, if you're in the lab, you could use one of these, but we want something that we can use in real time and we can use in the field, displayed on our watch to help guide our execution to achieve that specific stimulus that we're looking for. And there we add critical power or functional threshold power. I'll just say, as an aside, critical power, functional threshold power are the same conceptually. The only difference between them in terms of numeric estimate is the model and the protocol that are used to identify these. If you use the same model, same protocol, you're going to get the same number, and conceptually they're the same thing. They're identifying this phase transition between heavy and severe. In fact, Jones and Jones' group have gone so far as to say this is the gold standard for defining or marking the boundary between heavy and severe domain, or instead of boundary, the phase transition between heavy and severe. So critical power fits really nicely into this concept of physiologic or threshold, quote unquote. Again, I don't like that. Phase transition markers for training prescription. Another one that we will use in the power realm of run with power paradigm, is this. Conversational effort is an excellent in the field, real-time marker for that phase transition between moderate and heavy. And less than equal 80% of critical power or functional threshold power is sort of like this ceiling. It's sort of like the red alert. Don't go over this, and keep it at conversational effort. So just to elaborate just a little bit further, full conversation effort passes the talk test. What is that? That means you're able to run and recite entire paragraphs without taking, gasping for breath. Once you start having to interrupt multiple sentences to take a breath, and it becomes more abrupt sentences separated by breathing. That falls out, and you're above that threshold, above that phase transition between moderate and severe, or moderate and heavy. And then again, as I said, less than or equal to 80% of valid CP FTP is sort of like your ceiling. So if you're under 80% or no higher than 80%, and you're passing the talk test, your full conversational effort, and it feels easy, of course, that is the marker. It's a great marker for the phase transition between moderate and heavy. Now, that said, it's anything less than 80% and conversational. I have seen athletes that are 78% and they're fully conversational. That's fine. I've seen other athletes where they're sitting typically around 73% when they're fully conversational. The most important is this aspect, that it's fully conversational, and that allows you to, in real time, know whether you're in that domain or not. And then once you know that, you can associate it with something that is less than 80% of CP-FTP. So we can go even further. Once we have these primary blocks, we can go further and say, hey, look, let's look at it, take it from the didactic, where we have these commonly defined exercise intensity domains and these markers for the phase transitions. We take it from the didactic to the more practical. And then we will see that once we have these established, then we know we could get into these other domains within the domains. So let me tackle this first one here on the left, fat max and easy aerobic zone 2. I use quote zone 2 in quotes because there's many zone systems, and this is the more contemporary pop culture name of zone 2. So that's basically easy aerobic running. For most individuals, it's going to be below 80%, and I would actually extend this down to about 70%. So most individuals, they're going to be fully conversational, and they're in quote unquote zone 2 in that 70% to 80% of valid CP. All right. Fat max is even lower. It's maybe 10% lower, 60 to 65%. So when you're typically under 70% when you're in sort of fat max, where you're burning fat at the highest percentages of your energy substrate utilization is right around there. So we can further utilize power to define within some of those more didactic intensity domains, which leads to some of these others. When we talk about sub-threshold training, Norwegian singles, and tempos, they're typically in this mid to high end of the heavy domain, but they're capped by CP and FTP. You want to be below CP and FTP to be in this practical application of the heavy domain. And once we get over CP and FTP, we're into super threshold and max, all the way to max aerobic power intervals or high intensity interval training here. And then beyond that, beyond VO2 max, where you're able to pick out power duration prescriptions that will provide a VO2 max stimulus, you get beyond that where they start getting too short, too high intensity, and those are more the super max reserve work capacity and sprint intervals on the far right of the extreme domain. So we start here, define these important phase transitions. Then once we've done that, now we have ceiling here, we have a ceiling here, and we actually have a means of separating out our higher intensity interval training. We can go even further. With power, we can become even more precise. As I alluded to here with Fat Max and Easy Aerobic Zone 2, we can become even more precise, and we'll get into race effort domains. Or if you're familiar with Norwegian singles, you're familiar with these intensity domains within the sub-threshold intervals component of Norwegian singles. And so, within that domain, we could be even more precise to within, like, say, 3% wide prescription band. 96 to 99% of critical power FTP. Or a little bit lower, say it's 93 to 96% here. Or a little bit lower, or marathon power, which varies, from 97% if you're elite 2-hour marathoner, down to 85% and below if you're up closer to 4 hours. So there is a power and duration aspect to where these markers lie. But once you've identified for the individual, you can get down to 3% wide prescription bands and have very precise, using the words of the previous article, homeostatic perturbations, very precise stimuli. All right. And, if you go up here into the severe and extreme, you can use markers for VO2 max and reserve work capacity to enhance your prescription, but still the same concept, 8K, somewhere down here. Within that severe domain, 5K specific power, right in here, 3K, and then right on sort of the border, right around VO2 max, around 1,500 meter for most individuals. Around 1,500 meter power is sort of getting into that border area between severe and extreme. So the important thing is brought out by Alex is that, yes, using these threshold markers, quote unquote, or phase transition markers really enhances your training prescriptions. And once you get those primary markers, you can get into more significant, more precise markers within that. But this is a phase transition, a ceiling for the heavy. This is a phase transition, a ceiling for the modern. And then we could get into more severe, but more other markers that allow you to get more precise up here in the severe extreme. But these are the important building blocks for threshold, quote unquote, anchors, and training based on these threshold anchors. So, and these are the most important, because if I look at this didactic type of chart and convert it into what is the common training intensity distribution, a pyramidal training distribution, most of our training, look at the base of the pyramid, the most, and then the next most, and the next most, and the least most up here in the extreme domain. These markers are being utilized to identify the domains that we are training in for 90 to 95% of our training intensity distribution. So these are very important markers. They are far better than max anchors like max heart rate or heart rate reserve or percentage of VO2 max. They are the way to go. And if you've been involved with training with power, whether it's from the cycling realm or from the running realm, you already know this. And so thank you for allowing me to go into that elaboration. And thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.